Picture a silver teaspoon, polished to perfection, stirring sugar into morning coffee on April 14, 1823, in Savannah, Georgia. The gentle clink against fine china echoed through the Whitmore dining room as steam rose from the cup, carrying with it the sweet aroma of death. That sugar bowl contained arsenic, and the woman who served it every morning for 12 years. She smiled as she watched them drink. 7 coffins would leave the Whitmore mansion between 1821 and 1833, each carrying a victim of what doctors called mysterious wasting sickness. The truth was far more sinister. Their trusted housemaid, Sarah, had turned the breakfast table into an execution chamber. Every meal was a calculated murder. Her motive was not madness alone, but vengeance. Years earlier, the Whitmores had ruined her family, seizing her father's land through deceit and casting them into poverty. In her eyes, the daily bread she served was justice, each spoonful of poison a sentence carried out in silence. To the outside world, she was a loyal servant. In her own mind, she was balancing the scales of fate. Welcome to Echoes of Truth, where we uncover the secrets that history tried to bury. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most chilling cases of domestic terrorism ever recorded in the Antebellum South. Do you have the courage to hear what really happened in the shadows of Savannah's most respected home? Subscribe now and comment your location to join our investigation into the darkest corners of human nature. Step into 1820s Savannah, Georgia, where Spanish moss drips from ancient oak trees like funeral shrouds, and the humid air carries the scent of magnolias mixed with human suffering. The cobblestone streets of the historic district echo with the clip-clop of horse-drawn carriages, while the Savannah River flows past mansions built on the backs of enslaved souls. In this world of genteel Southern society, appearances meant everything. White-columned plantation houses stood as monuments to wealth and power, their perfectly manicured gardens hiding the brutal reality of human bondage. The summer heat was oppressive, clinging to your skin like guilt, while yellow fever epidemics swept through the city regularly, making sudden death so common that few questioned when the wealthy began dying in their beds. Church bells rang constantly, sometimes for worship, more often for funerals. The air itself seemed thick with secrets, and in the grand dining rooms where crystal glasses caught candlelight like tears, death was being served on silver platters. Now, you have to understand, this was a society built on the illusion of control, where white families believed they owned not just bodies, but souls. They never imagined that their most trusted servant was slowly, methodically, turning their own prosperity into poison. Meet the Whitmore family, Savannah's golden dynasty, whose wealth flowed from cotton fields worked by hundreds of enslaved people. Patriarch Jeremiah Whitmore was a respected banker and city councilman, known for his charitable donations to the Methodist Church and his humane treatment of his human property. His wife, Margaret, hosted elaborate dinner parties where she served French cuisine on imported china, her laughter tinkling through rooms adorned with portraits of dead ancestors. Their 3 adult children, Rebecca, Thomas, and Elizabeth, represented the pinnacle of Southern aristocracy, educated, refined, and utterly convinced of their inherent superiority. To their neighbors, they were the picture of Christian virtue and Southern hospitality. Jeremiah spoke often of his paternalistic duty to care for his enslaved workers, while Margaret prided herself on her gentle hand with the household staff. They attended church every Sunday, contributed to orphanages, and hosted charity events in their garden. But beneath this veneer of respectability lurked a darker truth. The Whitmores were known among the enslaved community for their particular cruelty, psychological torment disguised as kindness, punishment delivered with a smile, and a special talent for breaking spirits while maintaining their public image as benevolent masters. They separated families as casually as they rearranged furniture, and their gentle punishments often proved more devastating than outright brutality. The Whitmores publicly presented their household as a model of Christian stewardship, where enslaved people were treated as extended family members, guided by firm but loving authority. They spoke proudly of how they provided adequate food, clothing, and even basic medical care to their human property, often contrasting themselves with more openly brutal plantation owners. Margaret Whitmore frequently entertained visiting ladies with stories of her faithful servants who supposedly worked out of gratitude rather than compulsion. She claimed that her housemaid Sarah was particularly devoted, having been rescued as a young girl from a harsher plantation and blessed with indoor work away from the cotton fields. The family narrative painted Sarah as simple-minded but loyal, a woman who found purpose and protection under their benevolent care. They boasted to neighbors about how Sarah had never attempted to run away, never shown disrespect, and appeared genuinely content with her position. This cover story served multiple purposes. It reinforced their self-image as enlightened slaveholders, provided social credibility among their peers, and most importantly, it made Sarah invisible as a threat. Who would suspect a grateful, simple house servant of sophisticated revenge? The Whitmores had convinced themselves so thoroughly of their own benevolence that they never questioned Sarah's perpetual smile or her eagerness to serve their meals. They saw what they wanted to see, a perfect example of successful human ownership. The Whitmore mansion itself became Sarah's weapon, its very architecture serving her deadly purpose. The kitchen, located in a separate building connected to the main house by a covered walkway, provided perfect isolation for her work. Here, among cast iron pots and hanging herbs, Sarah had access to the family's entire food supply. The pantry, with its shelves of imported spices and preserves, offered countless opportunities to conceal poison. Most crucially, the household routine gave her complete control over meal preparation. She alone decided what the family ate, when they ate it, and in what quantities. The dining room, with its long mahogany table and crystal chandelier, became her theater of death, where she could observe her victims' reactions while maintaining the perfect mask of servitude. The mansion's isolation worked in her favor too. Set back from the street behind iron gates and towering oaks, screams and suffering could unfold without witness. The separate servants' quarters meant that other enslaved people rarely entered the main house, leaving Sarah to work alone. Even the mansion's medical supplies provided resources. The Whitmores kept laudanum and other medications that Sarah learned to manipulate. The house's grandeur itself was part of her camouflage. In rooms filled with priceless antiques and original paintings, who would suspect the quiet woman dusting the furniture of orchestrating mass murder? Every room she cleaned, every silver piece she polished, every bed she made became part of an elaborate death trap that took 12 years to spring. When the first Whitmore family member fell mysteriously ill in 1821, Dr. Cornelius Hampton attributed the symptoms to yellow fever, a convenient diagnosis in a city where the disease claimed hundreds of lives annually. The patient complained of stomach cramps, nausea, and gradual weakness, all consistent with the fever's early stages. As more family members developed similar symptoms over the following months, Dr. Hampton expanded his explanations to include marsh fever, nervous exhaustion, and constitutional weakness, all common medical catch-alls of the era. The Whitmore's wealth actually worked against proper diagnosis, as their refined lifestyle supposedly made them more susceptible to delicate constitutions and nervous disorders. When victims experienced hair loss and skin discoloration, Dr. Hampton blamed these symptoms on expensive imported cosmetics and the toll of grief from losing other family members. The gradual nature of the poisonings perfectly mimicked wasting diseases that were tragically common in the 1820s South. Dr. Hampton's reputation as Savannah's finest physician lent credibility to his diagnoses, and his detailed medical records provided official documentation that seemed to rule out foul play. The family's social status also influenced medical interpretation. Surely people of such refinement couldn't be victims of something as crude as murder. Even when symptoms appeared suspiciously similar across multiple family members, Dr. Hampton attributed this to shared environmental factors and hereditary weakness. His explanation satisfied both the family and the broader community, creating a medical smokescreen that protected Sarah's activities for over a decade. Dr. Cornelius Hampton was more than just an incompetent physician. He was Sarah's secret accomplice, though the full extent of his involvement remains one of history's most chilling mysteries. A Northern-educated doctor who had moved to Savannah in 1818, Hampton harbored deep but hidden abolitionist sympathies that made him uniquely susceptible to Sarah's influence. Their relationship began innocuously when Hampton treated a minor injury Sarah sustained in the kitchen, but it evolved into something far more sinister. Sarah, despite being denied formal education, possessed remarkable intelligence and an intuitive understanding of human psychology that she used to manipulate the lonely, conflicted doctor. She began by sharing carefully chosen details about the Whitmore's cruelty, painting herself as a helpless victim while subtly planting ideas about justice and revenge. Hampton, guilty over his comfortable life built on examining the bodies of enslaved people, found himself drawn into increasingly compromising conversations. Sarah learned medical terminology from him, understanding which symptoms to expect and how to space her poisonings to avoid suspicion. In return, she provided Hampton with information about other wealthy families' secrets, making him feel like a confidant rather than a dupe. The doctor's medical bag became another tool in Sarah's arsenal. He unknowingly supplied her with materials she claimed were for treating minor ailments among the staff. By the time Hampton realized the full scope of what was happening, he was too deeply implicated to expose Sarah without destroying himself. Their partnership represented a twisted inversion of the master-servant relationship, with an enslaved woman manipulating a free white man into becoming her unwitting instrument of death. The Whitmore family members who fell to Sarah's poison were more than just symbols of oppression. They were complex individuals whose personal flaws made them particularly deserving targets in Sarah's calculated mind. Jeremiah Whitmore, the family patriarch, was known for his habit of inspecting young enslaved women in private, using his position to commit acts that were never spoken of but widely understood. His wife Margaret took particular pleasure in psychological cruelty, forcing enslaved mothers to watch their children being sold while maintaining a serene smile. Their daughter Rebecca had inherited her mother's taste for emotional torture, often promising freedom to favored servants before laughing at their hope. Son Thomas was notorious for his gambling debts, which he paid by selling enslaved families without regard for keeping parents and children together. Youngest daughter Elizabeth seemed the most innocent, but was perhaps the cruelest, using her youth and beauty to manipulate enslaved men into compromising situations before having them brutally punished for inappropriate advances. These weren't random victims of Sarah's rage. They were carefully chosen targets who had each personally participated in the systematic dehumanization that defined the Whitmore household. Sarah had watched them destroy countless lives, break countless spirits, and commit countless acts of cruelty while hiding behind their facade of Christian respectability. Each victim had looked Sarah in the eye while committing acts of calculated brutality, never imagining that their quiet housemaid was cataloging every crime, planning every death, and preparing to serve justice on a silver platter. Their wealth, education, and social standing, everything that protected them from earthly consequences, meant nothing when their morning coffee was laced with death. Thomas Middleton's discovery of Sarah's poisoning operation plunged him into a nightmarish psychological crisis that would haunt him for the rest of his short life. The realization that he had been unknowingly dining on death for 3 weeks sent him into violent physical illness. He spent 2 days vomiting and shaking, convinced that Sarah had already begun poisoning him too. His northern worldview, which had prepared him to document the brutalities of slavery, had never conceived of an enslaved person wielding such sophisticated power over their oppressors. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. Everything he thought he knew about power dynamics in the South had been turned upside down. When Middleton tried to share his suspicions with other guests and neighbors, he encountered a wall of dismissal and hostility that left him questioning his own sanity. White Savannah society simply could not accept that a simple house servant could orchestrate such elaborate revenge. They accused him of Northern prejudice, suggesting that his abolitionist sympathies had created paranoid fantasies about innocent behavior. Dr. Hampton was particularly vehement in dismissing Middleton's theories, providing medical explanations for every symptom the young man documented. Even members of the Whitmore family, those still alive, refused to entertain the possibility that their trusted Sarah could harbor murderous intent. The social pressure was intense and coordinated. Middleton found himself increasingly isolated, branded as a troublemaker whose radical ideas threatened the natural order. This systematic denial forced him to question everything he had witnessed, creating a psychological torture that was almost as devastating as Sarah's physical poisoning. Now you have to understand, Middleton was trapped between his certainty about what he had seen and a society determined to make him doubt his own perceptions. The official investigation into Middleton's accusations was a masterpiece of Southern justice designed to protect the existing social order rather than uncover truth. City Marshal James Cunningham, a close friend of the surviving Whitmores, conducted what can only be described as a theatrical performance rather than genuine inquiry. His investigation consisted primarily of character testimonials praising Sarah's loyalty and devotion, collected from white neighbors who had never spent a day in the Whitmore household. Dr. Hampton provided detailed medical records supporting his various diagnoses, creating an impressive paper trail that seemed to scientifically disprove poisoning theories. The marshal interviewed Sarah herself in the presence of Margaret Whitmore, creating conditions where honest testimony was impossible, even if Sarah had been inclined to provide it. Most damaging to Middleton's credibility was the investigation's focus on his status as an outsider with radical sympathies, rather than his specific observations and evidence. Marshal Cunningham's final report concluded that the Whitmore deaths resulted from constitutional weakness exacerbated by grief and environmental factors, while dismissing Middleton's testimony as the fevered imaginings of an abolitionist mind predisposed to see conspiracy where none exists. The investigation's methodology was deliberately flawed. No physical evidence was tested, no independent medical examination was conducted, and no attempt was made to verify Sarah's activities or access to the family's food. This wasn't incompetence. It was calculated protection of a social system that could not acknowledge an enslaved person's capacity for such sophisticated revenge. The official inquiry's conclusions were welcomed by Savannah society because they confirmed existing prejudices and eliminated uncomfortable questions about the true nature of master-servant relationships. Let's be real. They were more interested in maintaining illusions than confronting reality. The surviving members of the Whitmore family provided the most compelling evidence of Sarah's systematic poisoning, though their own testimony worked against them in ways they never understood. Margaret Whitmore, once famous for her elaborate dinner parties and animated conversation, had become a hollow-eyed wraith who rarely spoke above a whisper. Her once lustrous hair had thinned to wisps. Her skin bore the telltale discoloration of chronic arsenic exposure, and her hands trembled constantly, symptoms that Dr. Hampton attributed to grief and nervous exhaustion. Rebecca Whitmore displayed similar physical deterioration, but more disturbing was her psychological transformation from sharp-tongued socialite to paranoid recluse who refused to eat anything not prepared by her own hands. The surviving son, Thomas, exhibited the characteristic muscle weakness and digestive issues of long-term poison exposure, yet continued to praise Sarah's devoted care, even as his body failed him. Most chilling was their unanimous insistence that Sarah had been their salvation during the family's tragic losses, describing how she had nursed them through their illnesses with tireless dedication. They couldn't see that their angel of mercy was actually the architect of their suffering, carefully calibrating doses to keep them alive as witnesses to her power while slowly destroying their health. Their physical deterioration told the real story. The gradual hair loss, skin changes, and nervous system damage that characterized chronic arsenic poisoning were written across their bodies like confessions. Yet their psychological dependence on Sarah had grown so complete that they defended her even as she destroyed them. I want you to picture this. Victims so thoroughly manipulated that they testified on behalf of their poisoner, their altered appearances serving as evidence they couldn't recognize or understand. The perfect crime wasn't just about avoiding detection, it was about turning victims into advocates for their own destroyer. Sarah's poisoning technique revealed a level of sophistication that challenged every assumption about enslaved people's intellectual capabilities and access to knowledge. Through her relationship with Dr. Hampton and careful observation of household medical practices, she had developed an understanding of arsenic's effects that rivaled formal medical training. Her methodology was diabolically precise. She used white arsenic powder, which dissolves easily in hot liquids and has minimal taste when properly diluted. The key to her success was dosage control. She administered amounts large enough to cause cumulative damage, but small enough to avoid acute poisoning symptoms that would trigger immediate suspicion. Sarah varied the timing and concentration of doses based on each victim's body weight, health status, and social schedule, ensuring that deaths appeared random rather than systematic. She exploited the family's routines ruthlessly, knowing that Jeremiah always took coffee with extra sugar, that Margaret preferred sweetened tea in the afternoon, and that the children had specific food preferences she could manipulate. Most ingeniously, Sarah used the family's own medical supplies against them. She learned to recognize and exploit the interactions between arsenic and legitimate medications like laudanum, creating compound effects that hastened death while obscuring causation. Her timing was psychologically calculated too. She would space poisonings to create periods of apparent recovery that reinforced the family's trust in her nursing care. Sarah even manipulated environmental factors, increasing doses during summer months when heat and humidity would exacerbate symptoms while providing natural explanations for discomfort. This wasn't random revenge, it was systematic biological warfare conducted with scientific precision by a woman whose intelligence had been deliberately suppressed and underestimated by those who owned her body, but never suspected the power of her mind. Enter Detective William Crawford, a former New York City police investigator who had relocated to Savannah after his own family tragedy left him seeking redemption in the fight against human bondage. Crawford was a broken man carrying his own ghosts. His wife and daughter had died in a tenement fire while he was pursuing criminals in another part of the city, leaving him with crushing guilt and a desperate need to save lives he couldn't save before. His police experience in New York had exposed him to sophisticated urban crimes that prepared him to recognize patterns that escaped rural Southern investigators. More importantly, Crawford's personal losses had stripped away his faith in social hierarchies and conventional assumptions, making him uniquely willing to consider possibilities that others dismissed. His unofficial investigation began when Thomas Middleton, desperate and discredited, sought out the one person in Savannah rumored to take unconventional cases seriously. Crawford's first meeting with the traumatized abolitionist revealed a methodical mind capable of seeing past surface appearances to underlying truths. Unlike Marshall Cunningham's theatrical inquiry, Crawford approached the case with systematic skepticism, treating every assumption as potentially false and every witness as potentially compromised. His investigative techniques, learned in New York's criminal underworld, included discreet surveillance, independent evidence collection, and most radically, direct communication with enslaved people whose testimony had never been considered relevant by Southern authorities. Crawford recognized that solving this case required abandoning everything white society assumed about intelligence, capability, and criminal potential among enslaved people. He understood that Sarah's greatest weapon wasn't arsenic. It was the systematic blindness of a society that refused to see enslaved people as fully human. Crawford's damaged soul and professional skills made him the perfect instrument to expose a crime that challenged the fundamental assumptions of antebellum Southern society. Crawford's infiltration of the Whitmore household required a delicate balance of deception and detection that pushed his investigative skills to their limits. Posing as a potential buyer interested in purchasing Sarah and other household staff, Crawford gained legitimate access to observe the daily routines that had concealed mass murder for over a decade. His first breakthrough came from interviewing enslaved people who worked in the gardens and stables, individuals who had never been questioned by official investigators but possessed crucial observational intelligence about the household's darker rhythms. These witnesses described Sarah's unusual nocturnal activities, her exclusive control over food preparation, and most tellingly, her uncanny ability to predict when family members would fall ill. Crawford documented physical evidence that others had ignored or misinterpreted: traces of white powder in unexpected locations, modified containers in the kitchen, and suspicious stains on clothing and linens that suggested repeated exposure to toxic substances. His most dangerous discovery came when he secretly observed Sarah preparing the family's evening meal, watching her add measured amounts of white powder to specific portions while maintaining her characteristic expression of devoted service. Crawford realized he was witnessing not just murder, but performance art. Sarah's ability to maintain perfect emotional camouflage while committing systematic killing represented a level of psychological control that terrified him. The detective's New York street experience had prepared him for criminal sophistication, but nothing had prepared him for the profound moral complexity of a victim who had become a victimizer. Crawford found himself simultaneously horrified by Sarah's methods and awed by her intelligence, recognizing that her crimes represented both monstrous revenge and a twisted form of resistance against systematic dehumanization. His investigation revealed that Sarah hadn't just poisoned bodies. She had poisoned an entire social system's assumptions about power, intelligence, and moral agency. Now, before we continue with what Detective Crawford discovered in that kitchen, I need you to understand something crucial about what you're hearing tonight. Can you handle what comes next? Because this is where the story turns truly chilling, where we uncover evidence so disturbing that it challenges everything we think we know about justice, revenge, and the human capacity for both cruelty and brilliance. What Crawford found wasn't just proof of systematic murder. It was evidence of a criminal mind so sophisticated that it forced even hardened investigators to reconsider their assumptions about human nature itself. If you're still with me, if you're ready to confront the darkest truths about how far people will go when pushed beyond all limits, then subscribe to Echoes of Truth right now and ring that notification bell. Comment below and tell me, could you maintain perfect composure while serving death to those who destroyed your life? And more importantly, what would you do if you discovered that someone you trusted completely had been planning your death for years? Share this episode with someone brave enough to handle the truth, because what we're about to reveal will change how you think about power, revenge, and the masks we all wear to survive in an unjust world. The next part of Sarah's story contains evidence so shocking that it was suppressed for over a century. But tonight, we're bringing it into the light. Crawford's most damning discovery came when he secretly searched Sarah's quarters in the slave cabin she shared with two other women, finding a horrifying collection of evidence that revealed the true scope of her systematic revenge. Hidden beneath loose floorboards, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from moisture, was a leather-bound journal written in Sarah's surprisingly elegant handwriting, evidence that she had secretly learned to read and write, despite laws prohibiting enslaved people's education. The journal entries, dating back to 1820, documented not just her poisoning activities, but her detailed observations of each family member's habits, preferences, and individual cruelties that had motivated their deaths. Most chilling were Sarah's clinical descriptions of her victims' declining health, recorded with the detached precision of a medical researcher studying the effects of her own experiments. Crawford discovered that Sarah had created detailed schedules for administering poison, calculating dosages based on body weight and desired timeline for each death, revealing a level of systematic planning that surpassed many professional criminals he had encountered in New York. The journal contained pressed flowers and leaves that Crawford initially dismissed as innocent decorations until he realized they were samples of plants Sarah had tested for toxic properties before settling on arsenic as her weapon of choice. Hidden alongside the journal were small vials of white powder, measuring spoons, and even crude drawings showing the layout of the kitchen and dining room with notations about optimal locations for poison distribution. Perhaps most disturbing was a section of the journal dedicated to psychological observations about her victims' personalities, describing their fears, vanities, and emotional weaknesses with the insight of someone who had spent years studying human nature while being treated as invisible. Sarah's intelligence, documented in her own handwriting, revealed a mind capable of sophisticated criminal planning that had been systematically suppressed and underestimated by those who claimed to own her. Crawford's discovery of Sarah's evidence triggered a deadly game of cat and mouse that transformed the genteel Whitmore mansion into a battlefield of survival and deception. Sarah had noticed Crawford's suspicious behavior days before he found her journal, and she had been preparing for this confrontation with the same methodical planning she had applied to her murders. When Crawford emerged from the slave quarters with her damning evidence, he found the mansion's doors mysteriously locked, and the other enslaved people nowhere to be seen. Sarah had somehow orchestrated their temporary absence, leaving her alone with the man who could destroy her. The chase that followed revealed Sarah's intimate knowledge of the mansion's hidden passages, storage areas, and architectural secrets that she had learned during 12 years of invisible servitude. Crawford found himself pursued through rooms where he had witnessed Sarah serving meals, past furniture she had polished while planning death, down corridors where she had walked countless times carrying poison to her victims. Sarah's pursuit was terrifyingly silent and systematic. She used her knowledge of the building's acoustics to track Crawford's movements while remaining undetected herself, turning the mansion into an elaborate trap. Crawford realized that Sarah had been preparing for this moment, perhaps for years, understanding that eventually someone would discover her crimes and she would need to eliminate that threat. The detective's survival depended on escaping not just a murderer, but a criminal genius who had transformed a symbol of Southern wealth into her personal killing field. Their deadly chase culminated in the mansion's kitchen, the very room where Sarah had prepared hundreds of poisoned meals, where Crawford found himself cornered by a woman whose intelligence and determination had been forged in the crucible of systematic oppression. I want you to picture this. Two people who understood the true cost of injustice, locked in mortal combat surrounded by the tools and settings where Sarah had served death for over a decade. Crawford's escape from the Whitmore mansion came at a terrible cost. Sarah had managed to dose his water supply with enough arsenic to cause immediate symptoms, leaving him violently ill and struggling to maintain consciousness as he stumbled toward the city center. His arrival at the sheriff's office, clutching Sarah's journal and vomiting blood, should have triggered immediate action, but instead revealed the depth of Savannah society's investment in maintaining comfortable illusions about enslaved people's capabilities. Sheriff Roberts, a longtime friend of the Whitmore family, initially dismissed Crawford's evidence as the fevered hallucinations of a sick man, suggesting that the detective had been driven mad by his exposure to unwholesome influences in the slave quarters. The journal's sophisticated writing and detailed planning were attributed to white accomplices. The sheriff refused to believe that an enslaved woman could possess such intelligence and criminal sophistication. Even more disturbing was the community's reaction when word of Crawford's accusations spread through Savannah's white society. Rather than horror at the revelation of systematic murder, the dominant response was outrage at the suggestion that a simple house servant could outwit educated white people for over a decade. Dr. Hampton's vehement denials of Crawford's medical evidence created additional obstacles, as the doctor's professional reputation provided credible opposition to the detective's claims. The social pressure to dismiss Crawford's evidence was enormous. Accepting his accusations would require acknowledging that enslaved people possessed intellectual capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy and social control. Crawford found himself fighting not just to expose Sarah's crimes, but to convince a society that was psychologically invested in believing such crimes were impossible. The reversal was complete. The detective who had solved the case became a pariah whose evidence was treated as more dangerous than the murders it revealed. The official raid on the Whitmore mansion, finally authorized after Crawford's persistent pressure and the arrival of federal marshals from Charleston, revealed a chamber of horrors that exceeded even the detective's darkest expectations. Sarah's slave quarters contained what investigators would later describe as a laboratory of death. An elaborate collection of poison-making equipment, detailed victim profiles, and experimental records that documented 12 years of systematic murder with scientific precision. The search uncovered multiple types of toxic substances beyond arsenic, suggesting that Sarah had been experimenting with different methods of killing and had developed expertise in toxicology that rivaled formally trained chemists. Most shocking was the discovery of personal items belonging to her victims: locks of hair, pieces of jewelry, and clothing fragments that Sarah had apparently collected as trophies from each successful poisoning. The mansion's kitchen revealed hidden compartments containing measuring devices, storage containers for various poisons, and even primitive distillation equipment that Sarah had apparently constructed from household items to purify her deadly compounds. Investigators found detailed floor plans of the house with notations marking optimal locations for poison distribution, escape routes, and hiding places. Evidence that Sarah had spent years preparing for eventual discovery and confrontation. The dining room, where the Whitmore family had consumed their final meals, contained traces of arsenic in the wood itself, absorbed from years of contaminated food and drink being served on the polished surfaces. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of Sarah's practice journal, containing records of her early experiments with plant-based toxins on household pests and small animals, showing how she had developed and refined her killing techniques before moving to human targets. The physical evidence painted a picture of criminal sophistication that challenged every assumption about enslaved people's access to knowledge and capacity for complex planning, revealing a mind that had turned oppression into education and servitude into the perfect cover for systematic revenge. The investigation's most shocking revelation was the discovery of Sarah's true identity and the full scope of the conspiracy that had enabled her decade-long killing spree. Born Sarah Williams in 1798, she was not the simple plantation-raised servant the Whitmores believed they owned, but the daughter of a free black physician from Charleston who had been kidnapped into slavery at age 10 when her family was murdered by slave catchers. Her father's medical books and instruments, hidden in the walls of her slave cabin, revealed how she had secretly educated herself in anatomy, pharmacology, and toxicology while maintaining the facade of ignorance that her survival required. More damning was the exposure of Dr. Cornelius Hampton's full complicity in the murders. Crawford's investigation revealed that Hampton had been deliberately misdiagnosing arsenic poisoning symptoms and had actually provided Sarah with medical supplies and guidance in exchange for information about other wealthy families' secrets and vulnerabilities. The doctor's Northern abolitionist sympathies had twisted into something darker, transforming him from an opponent of slavery into an enabler of murder who saw Sarah's crimes as justified resistance against an unjust system. Financial records showed that Hampton had been blackmailing other plantation families using information Sarah provided, creating a network of corruption that extended far beyond the Whitmore mansion. The revelation of Sarah's intelligence and education challenged fundamental assumptions about enslaved people's intellectual capabilities, while Hampton's involvement shattered beliefs about Northern moral superiority and professional ethics. Most disturbing was the discovery that Sarah had been planning to expand her operation, using her reputation as a trusted house servant to gain access to other wealthy families throughout Savannah and the broader region. Her journal contained preliminary profiles of potential future targets, revealing that the Whitmore murders were intended as merely the beginning of a larger campaign of revenge against the entire planter class. The unmasking revealed not just individual villains, but a systemic corruption that had enabled one woman's traumatic transformation from victim into sophisticated criminal mastermind. Crawford's investigation uncovered evidence that Sarah's poisoning operation was connected to a broader network of resistance and revenge that extended far beyond Savannah's city limits, revealing the existence of what investigators termed an underground railroad of retribution that had been operating throughout the antebellum South. Sarah's journals contained coded references to contacts in Charleston, Wilmington, and New Orleans. Other enslaved domestic workers who had been sharing information about toxic substances, criminal techniques, and potential targets among their respective owners. These communications, disguised as innocent domestic correspondence and transmitted through the same networks that moved runaway slaves to freedom, revealed a sophisticated intelligence operation that had been documenting the crimes and vulnerabilities of wealthy slaveholding families across multiple states. Dr. Hampton's complicity extended to providing medical knowledge and supplies to this network, while also serving as a communication hub that connected various cells of enslaved resistors who had chosen violence over escape as their response to systematic oppression. The international connections proved even more disturbing. Sarah had apparently been in contact with abolitionists in England and France, who provided her with information about poison-making techniques and chemical suppliers, turning her domestic resistance into part of a broader international effort to destabilize American slavery from within. Evidence suggested that similar poisoning operations were active in other southern cities, with domestic servants in at least 12 major households across 4 states potentially involved in what amounted to a coordinated campaign of deadly resistance that had claimed dozens of lives over nearly a decade. Now, you have to understand, the most chilling aspect of Sarah's story wasn't just the scope of her crimes, but how desperately Southern society worked to bury the truth once it came to light. The Savannah elite, faced with the terrifying reality that their most trusted servants might be their deadliest enemies, chose collective amnesia over accountability. Newspaper editors received direct threats from prominent families to suppress coverage of the investigation, while city officials quietly transferred Crawford to a remote posting in rural Georgia to silence his continued pursuit of the network's other members. Let's be real. Admitting that enslaved people had successfully operated a murder ring for years under their noses would have shattered the fundamental mythology of Southern paternalism and the supposed contentment of the enslaved population. The church where Sarah had attended services held emergency meetings to scrub any mention of her from their records, while the families of her victims collaborated to create alternative death narratives that blamed everything from yellow fever to heart conditions rather than acknowledge they'd been systematically poisoned by the woman who'd served their morning tea. Dr. Hampton's medical colleagues closed ranks around his reputation, destroying patient files and threatening any physician who might corroborate Crawford's findings about the suspicious death patterns. Even the federal authorities, when presented with evidence of the international connections, chose to classify the investigation to avoid diplomatic complications with European allies who might have been providing support to American abolitionists through such deadly channels. Sarah's fate, when it finally came, was both swift and shrouded in the same secrecy that had protected her for so long. Rather than face a public trial that would expose the full extent of her network and the complicity of respected citizens like Dr. Hampton, authorities arranged for her to be quietly transferred to a remote plantation in Alabama, where she allegedly died of pneumonia within 6 months, though Crawford's private notes suggest he suspected another poisoning, this time with Sarah as the victim. Dr. Hampton managed to preserve both his reputation and his freedom through a combination of political connections and strategic destruction of evidence, though he abandoned his medical practice within a year and relocated to Europe, where he lived comfortably on inherited wealth until his death from natural causes in 1859. Detective Crawford, the hero of our story, paid the highest price for his pursuit of truth. Stripped of his position, blacklisted from law enforcement, and forced to work as a private investigator handling minor domestic disputes, he spent his remaining years obsessively documenting other suspicious deaths among enslaved populations, creating an unofficial record that historians would only discover decades later. The other members of Sarah's network simply vanished into the anonymity that had protected them so well. Some likely escaped north through traditional underground railroad routes. Others may have continued their deadly work under new identities, and still others probably met the same mysterious fate as their leader. Most tragically, the families who'd lost loved ones to Sarah's poisoning never learned the truth about their deaths, carrying their grief and confusion to their own graves while the broader community chose willful ignorance over justice. I want you to picture this. In the decades following Sarah's disappearance, her story became a whispered legend among both enslaved communities and their owners, but for entirely different reasons. Among the enslaved, Sarah represented the ultimate expression of resistance, a woman who had turned the master's house into his tomb, who had wielded domestic intimacy as a weapon more effective than any rebellion or escape attempt. Her methods were studied, her courage celebrated in coded spirituals, and carefully guarded oral histories that portrayed her not as a murderer, but as a liberator who had chosen to fight fire with fire in a system that offered no legal recourse for the horrors inflicted upon her people. But among white Southerners, Sarah's legacy fostered a paranoia that would fundamentally alter the relationship between enslaved domestic workers and their owners. Suddenly, every cup of tea carried potential death, Every trusted servant might harbor deadly secrets, and the very intimacy that made slavery profitable also made it terrifyingly vulnerable. This fear contributed to increasingly brutal control measures and surveillance systems that made life even more miserable for enslaved people, while also accelerating the broader cultural conversation about slavery's inherent instability and moral corruption. The most profound legacy, however, lies in what Sarah's story reveals about the myth of enslaved passivity. Her calculated, patient, devastatingly effective campaign of revenge demonstrates that resistance took countless forms, many of which remained invisible to the historical record precisely because they were so successful. In choosing poison over escape, murder over martyrdom, Sarah forced a reckoning with the uncomfortable truth that oppressed people will find ways to fight back, and those methods won't always align with our comfortable notions of moral resistance. Could something like this happen today? Would we even see it coming? As you sit in your own home, surrounded by the people you trust most, your caregivers, your housekeepers, your service workers, ask yourself this haunting question. How well do you really know the hands that prepare your food, that clean your spaces, that move through your most private moments? Sarah's story forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that systems of oppression create their own forms of resistance, and that those who seem most powerless often possess the most intimate access to power's vulnerabilities. Her legacy lives on, not just in the historical record, but in every relationship where inequality meets proximity, where desperation encounters opportunity, where the seemingly powerless serve those who've forgotten that survival can sharpen into something far more dangerous than submission. If Sarah's story has left you questioning everything you thought you knew about power, resistance, and the hidden histories that shape our world, then subscribe to Echoes of Truth and join our community of fearless investigators. Comment below with your thoughts. Do you believe Sarah was a monster or a freedom fighter? And share this story, because the most dangerous conspiracies are the ones we choose to forget. Next week, we're diving into the chilling case of the Chicago World's Fair and the hotel owner who built America's first murder castle. But the real horror isn't what happened in those rooms. It's who helped him do it, and why their names were scrubbed from history. Trust me, you won't see this story coming, and once you hear it, you'll never look at grand hotels the same way again.